The ancient safe behind the false wall of the old Guthrie mansion had remained untouched for 37 years. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of the construction worker's flashlight as he peered through the gap his sledgehammer had accidentally created. What he saw made his calloused hands tremble. Stacks of documents bound with red ribbon, vintage photographs, and a leather journal embossed with the initials ERT. The worker, Miguel Santos, had been hired to renovate the mansion's library for its new owners, a tech company planning to convert the historic property into corporate offices. He wasn't supposed to be working alone on a Saturday evening, but overtime pay was overtime pay, and his daughter's college tuition wouldn't pay itself. Now, as he stared at what appeared to be decades-old secrets hidden behind what everyone assumed was solid wall, Miguel felt the weight of discovery settling on his shoulders like a shroud. One photograph caught his eye, a woman in an elegant gown standing beside a younger version of the oil baron whose portrait still hung in the mansion's grand foyer. But something about her face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen it. The woman's eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed to reach across the decades, as if she knew someone would eventually find these hidden treasures. As Miguel reached for the photograph, a gust of wind from somewhere within the old house extinguished his flashlight, plunging him into darkness. In that moment of blindness, he could have sworn he heard the distant sound of classical music and muffled conversation, as if the mansion were hosting one of its legendary charity galas from years past. When his light flickered back to life seconds later, the photograph had somehow shifted position, now lying face up at the very front of the pile, as if demanding to be seen. Miguel quickly photographed everything with his phone before sealing the wall back up, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled upon something that would change everything for someone, somewhere. He had no idea that 3 miles away, an elderly woman named Eleanor Rose Thompson was preparing for what she believed would be her final public appearance, carrying secrets that had shaped Oklahoma's charitable landscape for nearly 4 decades. Eleanor Rose Thompson stood before her bedroom mirror in the modest duplex on Edmond's east side, adjusting the same navy blue dress she'd worn to every charitable function for the past 8 years. The fabric had begun to thin at the elbows, and a small tear near the hem had been carefully mended with thread that didn't quite match, but it would have to suffice. At 73, Eleanor had learned to make do with what she had, a skill that had served her well since her husband Harold's death had left her with more medical bills than insurance coverage and a pension that barely covered utilities. The invitation to the Edmond Community Foundation's annual gala lay on her dresser, its elegant script mocking her current circumstances. She'd received similar invitations for decades, back when she could afford the suggested donation and appropriate attire. Now she attended only because her presence honored Harold's memory. He'd been a maintenance supervisor at the local high school for 35 years, and the foundation had established a small scholarship in his name after his passing. Eleanor's arthritic fingers struggled with the zipper, and she caught sight of her reflection's honest assessment, a thin woman with silver hair pulled into a simple bun, wearing a dress that had seen better decades. The contrast between her current appearance and the memories of her younger self struck her with unexpected force. There had been a time when she commanded attention in elegant ballrooms, when her opinions shaped philanthropic decisions affecting thousands of lives, when her name appeared on donor walls and in society columns. Those days felt like someone else's life now. The duplex thin walls allowed her to hear her neighbor's television, and the evening news was reporting on the gala she would attend in 2 hours. The anchor mentioned the expected attendance of Oklahoma's social elite, prominent business leaders, and longtime community supporters. Eleanor wondered if anyone would recognize her, if anyone remembered the woman she'd once been, or if she'd simply blend into the background as she had for nearly 8 years. Her late husband had never known the full truth about her past. Harold Thompson had fallen in love with Eleanor Rose, the quiet bank teller who'd moved to Edmond in 1987, claiming to be a widow seeking a fresh start. He'd been a kind, honest man who'd accepted her reluctance to discuss her previous life, attributing it to grief over her first husband's death. Their marriage had been built on genuine love and mutual respect, even if it had been founded on Eleanor's carefully constructed half-truths. Now, as she prepared to enter a world where she'd once wielded considerable influence, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of her concealed identity. The Edmond Community Foundation Gala would be attended by people who'd known her during her previous life. Though they had no reason to connect the elegant philanthropist they'd once known with the elderly woman in the faded dress who would slip quietly into the back of the ballroom. Eleanor's decision to attend tonight wasn't entirely voluntary. 3 days earlier, she'd received a peculiar phone call from someone claiming to be a researcher looking into Oklahoma's charitable foundations of the 1980s and early 1990s. The caller had asked specific questions about donation patterns and major benefactors from that era, questions that had made Eleanor's carefully maintained composure crack for just a moment. When she'd claimed no knowledge of such matters, the caller had mentioned they'd be attending the gala and hoped to speak with longtime community members who might have insights. The call had shaken Eleanor more than she cared to admit. For 8 years, she'd successfully maintained her anonymity, but something about the researcher's tone suggested they possessed information that could unravel everything she'd worked to protect. Her decision to attend the gala was partly reconnaissance. She needed to identify this person and determine what they knew. Eleanor's preparation for tonight's event had involved more than selecting her faded dress and ensuring her aging Honda would start. She'd spent 2 days reviewing newspaper archives at the Edmond Historical Society, searching for any recent articles that might explain renewed interest in Oklahoma's charitable foundations from the 1980s. What she'd discovered had been both reassuring and troubling. Several investigative journalists had begun examining tax records and donation patterns from that era, but none seemed to possess the specific knowledge that could directly implicate her former identity. The most concerning development had been a brief mention in the Daily Oklahoman's business section about a University of Oklahoma historian receiving a grant to study philanthropic irregularities in state history. The article had been buried on page 7, but Eleanor's trained eye had recognized the potential significance. Someone with academic credentials and institutional backing was asking exactly the kind of questions that could eventually lead to her doorstep. Eleanor's evening routine had also included a careful review of the small security measures she'd maintained throughout her years in Edmond. Hidden in her bedroom closet was a go-bag containing cash, identification documents in 2 different names, and contact information for people who could help her disappear again if necessary. Judge Preston had insisted on these precautions when he'd helped her create her new identity, and Eleanor had maintained them faithfully despite hoping never to need them. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She'd spent decades as one of Oklahoma's most connected philanthropic coordinators, wielding influence that could shape charitable giving across the state, only to end up as a widow struggling to afford a ticket to the kind of event she'd once organized. The transformation had been as complete as it was necessary, but moments like tonight made Eleanor acutely aware of everything she'd sacrificed for safety and anonymity. As Eleanor locked her duplex and walked to her 15-year-old Honda Civic, she carried with her not just the weight of her hidden past, but also a small leather notebook she'd kept hidden beneath her mattress for nearly 4 decades. The notebook contained information that could expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of Oklahoma's business and political establishment, information she'd gathered during her previous life but had never been able to use safely. The notebook itself was a masterpiece of careful documentation. Eleanor had developed a personal shorthand system that would appear meaningless to casual observers but recorded precise details about illegal activities she'd witnessed or discovered. Each entry was cross-referenced with dates, locations, and corroborating evidence that she'd accumulated over years of managing charitable foundations for Oklahoma's wealthiest families. Her system had evolved from necessity. As Eleanor Rose Thorne, she'd occupied a unique position in Oklahoma's social hierarchy, trusted enough to handle sensitive financial matters, but not important enough to be considered a threat. Wealthy donors had discussed business deals and political arrangements in her presence, assuming that a woman whose job involved managing charitable giving would have neither the interest nor the ability to understand or act on such information. They had been catastrophically wrong. Eleanor's background in accounting and her natural instincts for pattern recognition had allowed her to identify connections between charitable donations and questionable business practices that even experienced investigators might have missed. Her position with multiple foundations had given her access to financial records that revealed the scope of corruption affecting Oklahoma's business and political establishments. The notebook had been her insurance policy, but it had also been her burden. For nearly 4 decades, she'd carried the weight of knowing about crimes that had harmed thousands of people while being unable to safely expose the perpetrators. The powerful men who'd committed these crimes had demonstrated their willingness to use violence and intimidation to protect their interests, and Eleanor had seen enough evidence of their ruthlessness to understand that speaking out would likely cost her life. Tonight, Eleanor sensed, would either mark the end of her carefully maintained obscurity or the beginning of something she'd thought impossible, justice delayed but not denied. Eleanor's arrival at the Hilton Garden Inn was carefully timed to coincide with the period when early arrivals would be focused on cocktails and socializing, providing her the best opportunity to observe without being observed. She'd chosen a parking spot near the back of the lot, between a landscaping truck and a catering van, hoping her modest Honda would blend into the service vehicles rather than standing out among the luxury cars near the main entrance. The hotel's exterior had been decorated with elegant fall arrangements and welcoming signage that emphasized the Gala's charitable mission. Eleanor paused before entering, taking a moment to observe the parade of well-dressed attendees making their way from valet parking to the main entrance. The contrast between their confident bearing and expensive attire versus her own nervous approach in her faded dress struck her as a perfect metaphor for the evening ahead. Inside the ballroom, she immediately recognized the social hierarchy that governed such events. The room's center was dominated by couples in designer attire, the men in perfectly tailored tuxedos and the women in gowns that likely cost more than Eleanor's monthly income. Corporate sponsors occupied prominent tables near the podium, their place cards marking territories of influence and connection. Eleanor made her way to a table near the back, where other modestly dressed attendees sat quietly, nursing single glasses of wine and watching the spectacle with polite detachment. The ballroom's decor reflected the foundation's emphasis on community and growth, with centerpieces of autumn flowers and subtle lighting that created an atmosphere of warmth and prosperity. Eleanor noted the positioning of the silent auction displays, the location of the podium, and the placement of what appeared to be security personnel at strategic locations throughout the room. Her years of organizing similar events had taught her to read the logistics of social gatherings, and tonight's arrangements suggested a level of security that seemed excessive for a charitable function. What Eleanor hadn't anticipated was the immediate recognition from someone she'd hoped never to see again. Patricia Kellerman, now in her early 60s but still commanding in her silver-beaded gown, had been the social secretary for Oklahoma's most prominent oil family during the 1980s. Patricia's sharp eyes had always missed nothing, and tonight was no exception. As Eleanor settled into her seat, she noticed Patricia speaking intently with a small group of women, occasionally glancing in her direction with poorly concealed curiosity. Patricia's recognition was problematic for several reasons beyond the obvious threat to Eleanor's anonymity. During the 1980s, Patricia had served as more than just a social coordinator. She'd been a facilitator and intermediary for the kind of business arrangements that Eleanor had documented in her hidden notebook. Patricia's knowledge of Eleanor's previous identity was dangerous, but her knowledge of Eleanor's investigative activities was potentially fatal. The whispers began almost immediately. Eleanor caught fragments of conversation from nearby tables, comments about her outdated dress, speculation about who had invited that woman, and barely concealed amusement at her presence among Oklahoma's charitable elite. One particularly cutting remark came from Jennifer Walsh, wife of a prominent real estate developer, who wondered aloud why the foundation hadn't established better screening procedures for their events. Jennifer's comment stung more than it should have, partly because Eleanor remembered when Jennifer had been a young bride desperate to gain acceptance among Oklahoma's social elite. Eleanor had been instrumental in helping Jennifer navigate the complex social networks that governed charitable giving, and Jennifer's current position as a prominent philanthropist had been built on connections that Eleanor had facilitated. The irony of being dismissed by someone whose success she'd helped create added another layer of complexity to the evening's emotional landscape. Eleanor absorbed the social cruelty with practiced stoicism, but internally, she was conducting her own reconnaissance. The mysterious researcher who'd called her wasn't immediately obvious among the crowd, but several faces struck her as unfamiliar despite their apparent comfort in this setting. One man in particular, perhaps 40 years old with prematurely gray hair, seemed to be studying attendees more than participating in conversations. He carried a small leather portfolio and occasionally made notes, behavior that marked him as either a journalist or someone conducting exactly the kind of research that had prompted Eleanor's concerned phone call. During the dinner service, Eleanor found herself seated next to Dorothy Martinez, a retired teacher who'd worked with Harold during his final years at the high school. Dorothy's genuine warmth provided a buffer against the surrounding social hostility, and their quiet conversation about Harold's legacy scholarship recipients offered Eleanor a moment of peace amid the evening's tension. However, Eleanor's comfort was short-lived. As the Foundation's executive director, Michael Crawford, began his annual presentation about the organization's impact and future goals, Eleanor noticed Patricia Kellerman making her way toward the back of the room. Patricia's approach was calculated and deliberate, and Eleanor recognized the predatory gleam in her eyes that had once made her such an effective social gatekeeper for Oklahoma's elite families. Michael Crawford's presentation provided an unintentional backdrop for the drama unfolding in the ballroom's back section. As he discussed the Foundation's commitment to transparency and ethical giving, Eleanor found herself confronting the very people who'd corrupted Oklahoma's charitable landscape for decades. The Foundation's current leadership appeared to be genuinely committed to legitimate philanthropic work, but Eleanor knew that many of tonight's major donors had built their wealth through the exact practices that the Foundation now claimed to oppose. Patricia's arrival at Eleanor's table coincided with a moment when Michael Crawford was discussing the Foundation's historical donors and their lasting impact on the community. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. She was listening to praise for philanthropic work she'd once orchestrated while being scrutinized by someone who might expose her current circumstances to everyone present. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of social warfare disguised as concern. Patricia expressed surprise at seeing Eleanor at such an event, questioned how she'd managed to afford the ticket price, and made pointed observations about the importance of dressing appropriately for charitable functions. Each comment was delivered with a smile and couched in language that maintained plausible deniability, but Eleanor understood the threat being communicated. Patricia's interrogation revealed more than Eleanor had expected. In addition to questioning Eleanor's presence at the gala, Patricia made subtle references to recent inquiries she'd received from researchers and journalists who were stirring up old business that should remain buried. Her warnings about the dangers of reopening old wounds were clearly directed at Eleanor, but they also confirmed that others were investigating the same historical period that had prompted Eleanor's forced disappearance. During this uncomfortable exchange, Eleanor noticed that Dorothy Martinez was listening with growing concern and confusion. Dorothy's genuine kindness had made her protective of Eleanor, and Patricia's barely disguised hostility was clearly troubling to someone who'd known Harold as an honest, decent man. Eleanor realized that Patricia's approach might backfire if it generated sympathy and questions from other attendees who'd known Harold's character. The most revealing moment came when Patricia mentioned receiving a phone call from someone asking about the Rose Foundation's activities during the 1980s. The caller had possessed detailed knowledge about Foundation operations and had specifically asked about Eleanor Rosethorn's role in coordinating charitable activities. Patricia's description of the call matched Eleanor's own recent contact from the mysterious researcher, confirming that someone was systematically investigating the Rose Foundation's history and had connected Eleanor's previous and current identities. What Patricia didn't realize was that Eleanor was conducting her own investigation. While enduring the subtle interrogation, Eleanor observed Patricia's companions, noted their body language and conversation patterns, and began to piece together information about current power structures within Edmond's charitable community. More importantly, she confirmed her suspicion that someone had been asking questions about the foundation's history. Patricia mentioned receiving calls from researchers and journalists who were stirring up old business that should remain buried. The evening's first major revelation came during the silent auction preview, when Eleanor noticed a particular item that made her blood run cold. Among the donated pieces was a vintage photograph collection titled Oklahoma Philanthropy Through the Decades. And prominently featured was a picture from a 1985 charity gala showing her younger self standing beside the state's former lieutenant governor and several prominent business leaders. The photograph's caption identified her by her previous name and described her as one of Oklahoma's most influential charitable coordinators. The photograph had been donated by the Oklahoma Historical Society, which had apparently been organizing its archives and discovered the collection in storage. Eleanor's younger self smiled confidently from the frame, wearing an elegant emerald gown and standing in a position that clearly indicated her importance at the event. The contrast between that confident, influential woman and her current circumstances was stark enough to be jarring, but more concerning was the photograph's potential to trigger recognition from other attendees. Eleanor's panic deepened when she noticed Dr. Mitchell examining the photograph collection with obvious interest. He was taking notes and occasionally photographing specific images with his phone, behavior that suggested he was documenting evidence rather than simply appreciating historical artifacts. When their eyes met across the auction display, Eleanor saw recognition flash across his face, followed by a look of intense curiosity that confirmed her worst fears. The photograph's presence at the auction wasn't coincidental. Eleanor realized that someone had deliberately arranged for this evidence of her previous identity to be displayed at an event where people from her past would be present. The timing was too perfect to be accidental, and the potential consequences were too severe to ignore. Either Dr. Mitchell had orchestrated this revelation as part of his research, or someone else was manipulating events to force Eleanor into the open. Eleanor's response to this crisis revealed the survival instincts that had kept her alive for nearly 4 decades. Rather than fleeing immediately, she began to study the other auction items and their donors, looking for patterns that might reveal who was behind the evening's orchestrated revelations. What she discovered was both illuminating and terrifying. Several items had been donated by organizations and individuals connected to the Rose Foundation's investigation, suggesting a coordinated effort to gather evidence and witnesses in one location. The auction preview also revealed the presence of several people Eleanor hadn't initially noticed. A woman in her 50s who appeared to be taking photographs of attendees rather than auction items, a man in a server's uniform who seemed more interested in conversations than in providing service, and at least 2 people whose behavior suggested they were conducting surveillance rather than participating in a charity event. Eleanor realized that the gala had become a trap, but she wasn't certain whether she was the target or the bait. Eleanor realized that her past and present were about to collide in the most public way possible. And somewhere in this room was someone who possessed information that could destroy the quiet life she'd built with Harold or potentially expose the powerful people whose secrets she'd protected for nearly 4 decades. The weight of this realization forced Eleanor to confront a truth she'd been avoiding for years. Her protective anonymity had always been temporary. Judge Preston had warned her that eventually circumstances would force her to choose between continued hiding and active confrontation with the corruption she'd documented. That moment had apparently arrived, and Eleanor found herself unprepared for the emotional complexity of facing her past while surrounded by people who represented both her former life's greatest achievements and its most dangerous failures. As Eleanor returned to her table, she noticed that the dynamic in the ballroom had shifted subtly. Conversations seemed more intense, glances more calculating, and the overall atmosphere had acquired an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present earlier in the evening. Whether this change was related to her recognition or to other factors she hadn't yet identified, Eleanor sensed that the night's events were building towards something significant and potentially dangerous. Dorothy Martinez greeted Eleanor's return with concerned questions about her extended absence and obvious distress. Eleanor's explanation that she'd been overwhelmed by memories of Harold's charitable work was both truthful and misleading, providing cover for her real concerns while maintaining the protective fiction of her current identity. Dorothy's continued kindness and support provided Eleanor with an anchor of normalcy in an evening that was becoming increasingly surreal and threatening. The silent auction discovery sent Eleanor into a state of controlled panic. She excused herself from Dorothy's kind company and retreated to the hotel lobby, needing space to think and plan. The vintage photograph collection wasn't scheduled to be displayed until later in the evening, giving her perhaps an hour before her previous identity became visible to everyone at the gala. As Eleanor paced near the lobby's large windows, she noticed the man with the leather portfolio exiting the ballroom and approaching her. Dr. James Mitchell introduced himself as a historian from the University of Oklahoma who was researching Oklahoma's charitable foundations for a book about philanthropy in the Southwest. His questions were precise and well-informed, indicating research that went far beyond casual academic interest. Dr. Mitchell explained that his investigation had uncovered irregularities in donation patterns from the 1980s and early 1990s, particularly involving the Rose Foundation, a charitable organization that had mysteriously dissolved in 1987 despite controlling significant assets. The foundation's records had been sealed by court order, and its primary coordinator had disappeared from public view around the same time. He traced several leads to current Edmond residents, including Eleanor, though he admitted he wasn't certain why her name had appeared in his research. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized the extent of Dr. Mitchell's knowledge. The Rose Foundation had been her creation, a vehicle for channeling money from wealthy donors toward genuine charitable causes while maintaining detailed records of the donors' business practices and political connections. She discovered that several prominent Oklahoma families were using charitable donations to launder money from illegal oil deals, real estate fraud, and political corruption. Her evidence had been comprehensive enough to destroy careers and send people to prison, but it had also made her a target. The foundation's sudden dissolution and Eleanor's disappearance from Oklahoma society had been carefully orchestrated by her late mentor, Judge William Preston, who'd helped her create a new identity after receiving credible death threats. Eleanor Rose Thorne had become Eleanor Rose Thompson, trading her influence and wealth for safety and anonymity. The evidence she'd gathered had been sealed away, waiting for a time when it could be used safely. Dr. Mitchell's research had apparently uncovered enough traces of the Rose Foundation's work to reconstruct parts of the story, but he was missing crucial pieces that only Eleanor could provide. As they spoke, Eleanor realized that Dr. Mitchell represented both an opportunity and a danger. His academic credentials and university affiliation offered legitimacy that could protect the evidence from being dismissed or destroyed. But his investigation also threatened to expose Eleanor to the very people who'd forced her into hiding nearly 4 decades earlier. The conversation was interrupted by Patricia Kellerman's arrival in the lobby, accompanied by 2 men Eleanor recognized despite the decades that had passed. Richard Ashford and Thomas Pemberton had been young executives in their family businesses during the 1980s, but they'd inherited control of vast oil and real estate empires that had expanded dramatically since Eleanor's disappearance. Both men had been subjects of her investigation, and both had reasons to ensure that certain information never became public. The encounter that followed was a careful dance of recognition and threat. Patricia's introduction of Dr. Mitchell to the 2 businessmen was presented as a social courtesy, but Eleanor recognized it as a warning. Ashford and Pemberton's interest in Dr. Mitchell's research was framed as historical curiosity, but their questions revealed intimate knowledge of the Rose Foundation's activities and genuine concern about what records might still exist. Eleanor remained largely silent during this exchange, but she was taking mental notes about everything being said. The conversation confirmed her suspicions that the Rose Foundation's dissolution hadn't ended the corruption she'd uncovered. It had simply allowed it to continue without oversight. Ashford's company had received numerous state contracts over the past 3 decades, and Pemberton's real estate developments had benefited from zoning decisions that had displaced low-income communities throughout central Oklahoma. The evening's second major revelation came when Dr. Mitchell mentioned his recent discovery of documents in an old mansion being renovated in Guthrie. The construction worker who'd found the hidden safe had contacted the university after photographing its contents, recognizing that the materials had historical significance. Dr. Mitchell had spent the past week reviewing copies of documents that appeared to be the Rose Foundation's missing records, evidence that Eleanor had assumed was lost forever. Eleanor realized that Judge Preston had hidden backup copies of everything in a location he'd never revealed to her, insurance against the possibility that her primary evidence might be destroyed or compromised. The judge had died 12 years earlier, taking the secret of the hidden records with him, but fate had finally brought them to light. As the group prepared to return to the ballroom for the auction, Eleanor made a decision that would transform her quiet retirement into something far more dangerous. She quietly told Dr. Mitchell that she had additional information about his research and suggested they meet privately after the gala. The historian's eager agreement was overshadowed by the calculating look she received from Ashford and Pemberton, who clearly understood that their carefully protected secrets were about to be exposed. Eleanor's transformation from invisible widow to potential whistleblower had begun, but she knew that the most dangerous part of her journey lay ahead. The powerful men who'd forced her into hiding decades earlier were now even more wealthy and influential, and they had far more to lose if the truth about their activities became public. The remainder of the gala proceeded with Eleanor positioned at the center of a carefully orchestrated drama. The vintage photograph collection was displayed as scheduled, and Eleanor watched as recognition dawned on several faces throughout the ballroom. Whispered conversations intensified, and she noticed security personnel, clearly not hotel staff, positioning themselves near exits and maintaining visual contact with Dr. Mitchell. The evening's climax arrived during the Foundation's presentation of major donors and community partners. Michael Crawford, the Foundation's executive director, had prepared remarks celebrating the organization's history and thanking longtime supporters. However, his presentation was interrupted by Dr. Mitchell, who'd apparently decided that a public venue offered better protection than a private meeting. Dr. Mitchell's impromptu presentation began as an academic overview of Oklahoma's philanthropic history, but quickly focused on the Rose Foundation's work during the 1980s. Using slides prepared from the recently discovered documents, he outlined a pattern of charitable organizations being used to legitimize questionable business practices and political corruption. The audience's initial polite attention transformed into uncomfortable tension as Dr. Mitchell named specific individuals and organizations, many of whom were present in the ballroom. Eleanor realized that Dr. Mitchell's academic courage was about to get both of them killed. Ashford and Pemberton had moved to flank the historian's position, while Patricia Kellerman was coordinating with the security personnel to control the situation. The ballroom's doors had been quietly secured, and Eleanor recognized the signs of a carefully planned containment operation. The moment that changed everything came when Dr. Mitchell displayed a photograph of Eleanor from 1985, identifying her as the Rose Foundation's primary coordinator who'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The ballroom fell silent as hundreds of eyes turned toward Eleanor's table, and she realized that her decades of anonymity had ended in the most dramatic way possible. What followed was Eleanor's moment of truth. Rather than fleeing or denying her identity, she stood and walked to the front of the ballroom, carrying the small leather notebook she'd protected for nearly 40 years. Her voice, strengthened by decades of carrying impossible secrets, filled the room as she confirmed Dr. Mitchell's research and began to reveal information that the discovered documents couldn't provide. Eleanor's testimony was precise, devastating, and carefully documented. She outlined how prominent Oklahoma families had used charitable foundations to launder money from illegal activities, how state contracts had been awarded through bribery and influence peddling, and how communities had been displaced to benefit connected developers. Her notebook contained names, dates, amounts, and detailed records of conversations she'd overheard or participated in during her years as the Rose Foundation's coordinator. The ballroom's atmosphere shifted from social discomfort to genuine crisis as Eleanor's revelations continued. She named sitting politicians who'd received illegal campaign contributions, described real estate deals that had defrauded the state, and detailed oil industry practices that had violated federal environmental regulations. Each revelation was supported by specific evidence that Dr. Mitchell's research had confirmed and that Eleanor's records could verify. Ashford and Pemberton's attempt to stop Eleanor's testimony backfired spectacularly when she revealed that both men had personally threatened her in 1987, forcing her to abandon her life and assume a new identity. Their current presence at the gala, combined with the suspicious security arrangements, only reinforced her claims about their continued criminal activities and willingness to use intimidation and violence. The crisis reached its peak when Eleanor announced that copies of all evidence had been provided to the FBI, the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, and several news organizations prior to the evening's events. Her apparent vulnerability had been carefully orchestrated protection. Dr. Mitchell's research had provided the academic credibility needed to ensure the evidence would be taken seriously, while the gala's public setting had forced her adversaries to reveal themselves. Eleanor's final revelation transformed the entire narrative. She hadn't attended the gala as a widow seeking charity, but as someone ensuring that justice finally had its day. Her modest appearance and apparent poverty had been a deliberate disguise, maintained while she'd spent 8 years working with federal investigators to build cases against the powerful men who destroyed her previous life. The resolution came swiftly once Eleanor finished her testimony. FBI agents who'd been positioned outside the hotel moved in to execute arrest warrants for Ashford, Pemberton, and several other attendees whose names had appeared in Eleanor's evidence. The charity gala transformed into a crime scene, with Oklahoma's social elite witnessing the downfall of some of their most prominent members. Dr. Mitchell's academic research had provided the perfect catalyst for exposing corruption that had been protected for decades, while Eleanor's patient planning had ensured that the evidence would be presented in a way that couldn't be dismissed or destroyed. The widow in the faded dress had orchestrated one of Oklahoma's most significant corruption investigations while maintaining the perfect cover of invisibility and poverty. 6 months after the gala that changed Oklahoma's political landscape, Eleanor Rose Thompson, she decided to keep Harold's name as a tribute to their genuine love. Stood in the conference room of the newly established Thompson Center for Ethical Philanthropy. The center, funded by recovered assets from the Rose Foundation investigation, occupied a renovated building in downtown Edmond and served as both a research institute and a training center for nonprofit organizations. The federal investigations that followed Eleanor's revelations had recovered over $40 million in fraudulent assets, money that was being returned to communities that had been harmed by decades of corruption. The Ashford and Pemberton families had seen their business empires dismantled, with both patriarchs receiving substantial prison sentences. Patricia Kellerman, whose role as a social coordinator had included facilitating illegal activities, was serving as a witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. Dr. Mitchell had received tenure and national recognition for his role in exposing the corruption, but he consistently credited Eleanor with providing the courage and evidence that made justice possible. His book, The Rose Foundation: How One Woman Fought Oklahoma's Hidden Corruption, had become a bestseller and was being adapted for a documentary film. Eleanor's own transformation had been remarkable. No longer needing to maintain her disguise of poverty, she'd revealed that Judge Preston had established a trust fund that had grown substantially over the decades, ensuring that her financial struggles had been a choice rather than a necessity. The modest duplex had been replaced by a comfortable home near the University of Oklahoma, where she served as a visiting lecturer on nonprofit ethics and corruption prevention. The most meaningful change, however, was the impact on communities throughout Oklahoma. The recovered funds had supported educational programs, affordable housing initiatives, and healthcare services that had been neglected for decades. Eleanor's evidence had also led to reforms in how charitable organizations were regulated and monitored, preventing future abuse of the philanthropic system. As Eleanor prepared for another day of training nonprofit leaders, she often reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. Harold would have been amazed to learn about her previous identity, but she believed he would have supported her decision to seek justice, even at personal cost. Their marriage had been built on love and respect, values that had sustained her through the most difficult periods of maintaining her secret identity. The supernatural element that seemed to guide Eleanor's journey manifested in small but meaningful ways. The construction worker who'd discovered Judge Preston's hidden safe had used his reward money to establish a scholarship fund for children of immigrant families, honoring his own parents' sacrifice. The old Guthrie mansion had been preserved as a historical site, with the hidden room maintained as a testament to the importance of protecting evidence and speaking truth to power. Eleanor sometimes sensed Judge Preston's presence when she worked late in the Thompson Center, reviewing cases of potential corruption or training young investigators. The judge's portrait hung in the center's library, and visitors often commented on the strength and wisdom evident in his painted eyes. Eleanor knew that her mentor would have been proud to see his careful planning finally bear fruit, bringing justice to those who'd thought themselves untouchable. The story of the widow at the charity gala had become legendary in Oklahoma, taught in journalism schools as an example of how appearance could deceive and how patience could enable justice. Eleanor's willingness to endure years of mockery and social invisibility in service of a greater good had inspired a new generation of investigators and activists. As evening approached and Eleanor prepared to lock up the Thompson Center, she paused at the window overlooking downtown Edmond. The city had changed significantly since her return to public life, with new transparency requirements and ethical oversight that made corruption far more difficult to hide. Her sacrifice had created lasting change that would protect future generations from the abuses she'd uncovered. Eleanor's final reflection as she drove home was that truth, like justice, might be delayed but could never be permanently silenced. The Rose Foundation's legacy lived on, not in the corrupted organization that had been destroyed, but in the ethical philanthropy and governmental accountability that had grown from its ashes. The widow who'd been mocked for her old clothes had ultimately achieved something far more valuable than social acceptance. She'd helped create a more just society for everyone who followed in her footsteps. Eleanor's role at the Thompson Center extended beyond administration and training. She'd become a sought-after consultant for law enforcement agencies investigating corruption cases, and her expertise in recognizing patterns of fraudulent charitable activity had proven invaluable in numerous investigations across the Southwest. The FBI had classified her as a protected witness, but her public role in fighting corruption had made her a symbol of hope for communities that had been harmed by the very practices she'd spent decades documenting. The personal cost of Eleanor's transformation hadn't been insignificant. Her decision to abandon anonymity and actively fight corruption had required her to give up the quiet retirement she'd planned with Harold's memory. Instead, she'd found herself thrust into a world of depositions, court testimony, and constant security precautions that reminded her daily of the dangers inherent in challenging powerful interests. However, the rewards had been profound. Eleanor's work had directly contributed to the recovery of funds that had benefited thousands of Oklahoma families, and her testimony had helped establish legal precedents that made similar corruption more difficult to perpetrate and easier to prosecute. The widow who'd been mocked for her old clothes had become one of Oklahoma's most respected advocates for ethical governance and transparent philanthropy. The supernatural elements that had seemed to guide Eleanor's journey continued to manifest in meaningful ways. Harold's Scholarship Fund, established by the high school where he'd worked, had grown substantially through donations from people inspired by Eleanor's story. The scholarship recipients often reported uncanny coincidences and opportunities that seemed to appear just when they needed them most, as if Harold's spirit continued to guide young people toward education and ethical service. The Thompson Center's library had become a repository not just for Eleanor's documents and Judge Preston's papers, but for materials donated by other whistleblowers and reformers who'd been inspired by her example. The collection served as both a research resource and a reminder that corruption could be defeated when courageous individuals were willing to sacrifice personal comfort for public good. Eleanor's evening routine now included reviewing cases submitted by citizens who suspected corruption in their own communities. Her ability to recognize patterns and identify evidence had been honed by decades of experience, and she took pride in helping people who found themselves in situations similar to her own past circumstances. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, but it provided Eleanor with a sense of purpose that her quiet retirement had never offered. The roses in Eleanor's garden bloomed that spring with unusual vibrancy, as if nature itself were celebrating the triumph of truth over deception, of courage over fear, and of justice over corruption. In the quiet moments of her transformed life, Eleanor could almost hear Harold's voice expressing pride in the woman he'd married, even if he'd never known the full extent of her remarkable story. The garden had become a place of reflection and renewal, where Eleanor could process the ongoing challenges of her public role while maintaining connection to the love and peace she'd shared with Harold during their years together.